It is such an honor to be here with you all. As some of you know, I flew in this morning and I'm flying out this evening because when I was given an invitation to come and just introduce and share a little bit about Ed, I could not say no. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about Ed's life, and then if you will indulge me, I'd like to share a little bit about what he has been to me, and why I got up at 5 this morning to be here, which is not just because he was a fantastic leader at the Washington Ethical Society and later in New York and president of the American Ethical Union, although all those things are true. You can actually read a little bit of his biography in the program that you have. Ed, like me, started out in what was then the Unitarian movement, now the Unitarian Universalist movement. He attended Starr King School for the Ministry. And one of the first times I visited with Ed, he talked about why he went into religious leadership, became a clergy person, rather than into academia, which I think had been the path initially that he considered. And he talked about seeing the example in Europe and noting that it was often clergy who were working most clearly against the fascists. And that for that reason, that's why he made a decision to change. And I think that little tiny anecdote is actually a beautiful representation of Ed's life and how he has chosen to use that life over and over again in many different aspects of his career and his writing. So he went to Starr King School for the Ministry out in California and then served Unitarian congregations in Oregon and in Fairfax, Virginia. And then from Fairfax was invited and joined the Washington Ethical Society as the leader there. That, of course, was the best part of his career. I mean, obviously. After that, I don't know, something in New York. He served as leader at the New York Society for Ethical Culture and then also as president of the American Ethical Union. You can see some of the things that he's the author of 4 books and a signer of the second iteration of the Humanist Manifesto. His book, The Humanist Way, is still the book that I recommend to folks at the Ethical Society. If they tell me they want to read more about ethical culture, I say, well, you could read Adler. I have several dictionaries that you can bring with you. And do. And you've got to make sure to get The Humanist Way. And I understand that there are copies of The Humanist Way here, and you've got to make sure to get it. It really is a beautiful articulation of ethical humanism as a religious and philosophical way of life. And that's, I think, what sets it apart. It is about living ethical culture. And that's so much what Ed has done and who Ed is. So while Ed was in Washington, which is the part of his life that I know most about because those are the stories that I like to hear when I get to visit with Ed and Carol, he worked for civil rights against the Vietnam War. Actually, early, one of the parts of that story is that Ed spoke out against the war before folks in D.C. were quite sure. And I often use that as an example at the Washington Society that we can hold disagreement about issues and still stay together as a community. And he modeled that so beautifully, his clarity of value while also serving the wider community and congregation. One of the things that Ed did as part of his work in Washington was to work nationally to expand conscientious objector status from folks who could apply only for religious reasons, so think about Church of the Brethren and Quakers, to expanding it to include ethical reasons, so ethically unable to be part of the military in that way. And that's a good segue to the personal. My father was a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War. My parents got married because they expected that he would be jailed because he was not part of a religious group. He's a secular humanist. And he went up before the board just after the law was changed. So because of Ed, my father instead served 2 years of alternative service in a medical facility for the government. And we sort of discovered that when I first started at Wes, and it's just been one of the things that has made my collegial relationship with Ed feels so personal to me. So I want to tell you just a couple other things. One of my favorite things to do in the summer when Ed and Carol are in the DC area is to go and visit them at their lovely home there. And I will say Carol is very much a part of visiting Ed and Carol, and so I'm so pleased that you're here and your son is here, Carol. I kind of come into this gracious hospitality and tea and cookies and really block off my afternoon, because what I want is to be able to hear the stories, and I hope that you'll be able to hear some of those stories from Ed today as well. What has been most inspiring to me is hearing Ed talk about those years in Washington, years that were often very difficult in the national stage. And the work that he did and the values he tried to bring to that work. You know, Ed has accomplished so much that I can imagine feeling sort of intimidated, but because of who he is, I find myself instead inspired and invited into the work. In the last few years in particular, when Washington has been, again, a somewhat challenging place to be, and the national stage has been a challenging one, I have to say I have found nothing more comforting than talking with Ed and hearing about the work that he did in other difficult times, to remember that we have done hard things before and we have taken strong stands and we have moved forward with justice has been truly a gift to me, as I have tried to do just a tiny bit of the same kind of thing in DC in these times. And then finally, just very personally, Ed, I don't know that you are going to remember this particular experience, but a number of years ago, after a really trying time at Wes, I was going to visit Ed and Carol, and it had been a long year, and I was feeling kind of downtrodden and wasn't quite sure that I was going to be up for the visit, and was unsure sort of, how I would be received. And I walked into the apartment, and Ed just came forward and stretched his hand out and said, "Hello, colleague." And that, to me, is such an example of who he has been in the movement. This incredible figure, unbelievable achievements, should be totally intimidating, and instead he is welcoming, inspiring, and invitational, inviting all of us to continue to live the legacy that he is still creating. So I am just really honored to be able to be here and share a little bit about how much I have enjoyed and appreciated getting to be your colleague, Ed. And I'm going to invite John McCormick to, I think, do the honors.
If I may read the inscription, the American Ethical Union presents Edward L. Ericson the Felix Adler Lifetime Achievement Award in recognition for many years of service on behalf of the ethical culture movement. Ed.
I wish to thank the American Ethical Union for this marvelous honor. I also want to thank the Tarpon Springs Unitarian Universalist Church that has presented me with this bouquet. It's taken me 90 years to be a bride. However, I have an authentic bride here, a perennial, lasting bride, the love of my life. Carol and I have been partners for 25 years. the most wonderful years of my life. And I'm going to re-gift these flowers to Carol. Carol is the daughter of L.D. McIntyre, who served 8 years as president of the AEU in the 1950s, and I am the result of his misdeed. It was in the waning months of his term as president of the AEU when he encouraged me to consider moving to the Washington Ethical Society. He said, "Please do it while I'm president so it will happen." He raised his daughter with Alice. They raised their daughter in the St. Louis Ethical Society. She came from a liberal Jewish family. He came from a strict Calvinist Scottish family. And they sought a common ground for their 3-year-old or 4-year-old daughter, Carol. So they joined the St. Louis Ethical Society, and the rest is history. I want to thank Amanda for those beautiful words of hers. As I listened carefully to this amazing man that she described, I made a resolution that someday I want to meet him. And I wish to welcome you to the city of my birth. I was born in Tampa in a private home, private residence on East Curtis Street in January 1929, that infamous year. And my parents built a little house a few months later in what was then Piney Woods. It's not Piney Woods anymore, just a stone's throw from the intersection of Cypress Street and Memorial Highway. So I stand on native turf. I owe special thanks and wish to give special recognition to the National Ethical Service Group. When I knew this organization in an earlier phase, it was the National Women's Conference. A wonderful group of activist women who enlarged it, and it became co-ed, so that now we of the male persuasion are allowed to be members. I saw the work of the Women's Conference in those years. When I first came to the New York Society, they were extremely active and had been active for years, representing us as an NGO, national non-governmental organization at the United Nations. They were diligent, they were competent, and they were well respected. I went to a luncheon, sort of an informal banquet, really, of the NGOs, and I saw the way in which they moved in that group and with the respect with which they were met. We are indebted to them. And key to that was Rose Walker. I met Rose Walker before I ever gave an address as leader of the Washington Ethical Society. When I went there in 1959, 60 years ago, this summer, I had just moved from the Fairfax Unitarian Church to become leader of the Washington Ethical Society. It wasn't even holding meetings in the summer months. But I received a call that there was a conference, the White House Conference on Children and Youth, and a group of ethical culturists were going to be involved in that meeting. It was a group of 3 or 4 women. Rose Walker was there. So I knew her 60 years ago, and she labored long and hard to make this an effective organization. And today, the United Nations is under attack, even disparaged at from the highest office in this land. We need the United Nations. We worked hard for the United Nations, and the United Nations represents the last great hope of humanity. And I wish to congratulate and honor the people of the Ethical Service Group Committee Conference for what they are doing there. It is one of our outstanding projects. I want to leave one little message, if I may. Don't think of the American Ethical Union as a small organization. It is an enormous organization with profound and far-reaching influence, far respected beyond its measure, its numbers. I have had this demonstrated many times. It is true, as Amanda said, that the change in the wording of the law saved many young men from prison because they were non-theists or because they did not belong to a religion. And I had the opportunity of hearing from the executive director of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Senator Russell's committee, that it was my testimony that persuaded Russell that the very narrow definition of religion in the law should be changed. That law described religion as belief in a supreme being involving duties superior to any human relationship. That's not just establishing religion. It's establishing a narrow orthodoxy of religion. Many theists, many pious Christians see their relationship to their God through their relationships, right relationships with their fellow beings. And for us humanists, right relationships among human beings is all that it's about, all that there is. If there is anything divine, if there's anything holy, if there's anything sacred, it is the love and caring and the empathy that human beings have for each other. When I testified before that committee, it was a surprise to Senator Russell, I later learned, and for the committee, that there was such a thing as a non-theistic religion. They had never heard of it. But Russell was convinced enough to get his staff to research the question, and yes, as I had said, there were non-theistic religions in the world, and I chose Buddhism, the original Hinayana Buddhism, as an example of a non-theistic religion. And their research, yes, there is such a religion. And when Russell, on the floor of the Senate, argued to drop this definition of religion, let it be defined as people themselves choose to define it. A senator from Colorado questioned him on non-theism, and Russell said, well, what is this ethical culture? He said, well, I don't know of any humanist or ethical culturists in my state. This is in the congressional record. Perhaps, sir, there are more in your state of Colorado. I was told by the chief of staff of his committee that Russell had learned that fact from the testimony that I gave on behalf of the American Ethical Union. And when on the basis of that and of his report, I set up a group of, under the aegis of what we call the Center for Applied Ethics, think tanks on various specialties, various professional groups dealing with problems in government and business. One of those was conflicts of interest in the securities industry. This attracted the attention of a number of people in Washington. I was invited to sit down with the chairman of the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission. But the day I went, the chairman was called to testify before Congress, so I had to settle for his deputy. That with that background for ethical culture, I was invited by the newly inaugurated President Carter, by his White House counsel, to establish a think tank on improving and strengthening the ethics laws of this country. We rendered a report after study that we collected 14 men, 14 very distinguished, they weren't all men, 14 distinguished people from the New York area. The deputy mayor of New York, for example, and others, and Sidney Shawyer, who had served in Roosevelt's time as the administrator of the Economic Warfare Board during the Second World War. With such people, we were able to write a good, strong recommendation of ways to strengthen the law. And when we sat with the counsel to the White House counsel to the president, he gave us over an hour. We were in the Roosevelt room opposite the Oval Office. And at the end of that time, as the men of the committee rushed to catch the trains and planes back to New York, I guess they were all men, that particular group, Robert Lipschitz, the White House counsel, said, "Ed, can you remain behind, because I would like to call the Senate, the Governmental Affairs Committee, to suggest that your testimony, that your report become part of the written testimony on changing the ethics laws, strengthening them, by using civil enforcement, which is a much easier route than criminal prosecution. This means to discourage the revolving door that certain officials must sign an agreement, a contract, that they will not move back and forth between government and private business in ways that involves conflicts of interest." That is the law today. And for a time it worked. But we learn another lesson. Reform has a very short shelf life. Every generation must fight the battles over and over again. We marched in Montgomery, Alabama. I was there with a number of others from the ethical, humanist, and Unitarian and other liberal groups, the Quakers, falling in line behind Martin Luther King at the time of the Selma massacre, is what it amounted to. One of my very best friends and former colleagues, Jim Reeb, who was assistant minister of the All Souls Unitarian Church and then served with the Friends Service Committee in Boston, Massachusetts. Jim Reeb was bludgeoned to death by a crazed segregationist. We lost people, but we won. We got a Voting Rights Act, preceded by a General Civil Rights Act of supporting desegregation. We won. And then we started losing ground again. We are resegregating. We are losing our civil liberties that generations of liberal thinking people have struggled for many years. You're here to address the business of reclaiming democracy. Well, we never really had a democracy. We had part of a democracy. Ask the remnant of the slaughtered Indians whose land we stole. We don't like the Mexicans, those brown-skinned people who are in California or Texas or Arizona. We forget we stole that land from Mexico. We took 1/3 of Mexico. We went across the boundaries and we settled there, and then we grabbed the entire territory. So the real language of this United States is Spanish, and we have an English-only movement in this country. Growing up, not growing up, but entering school in this city of Tampa, my first grade, before we moved over to Dunedin on the coast, at least a third of the members of my class spoke little or no English. They were Cuban children, Italian children. There were no foreign language classes. They sat in first grade and learned English that way. As my own dad in Boston spent the first grade after his family immigrated and spent a year in Boston before moving to Florida. And it was there that my dad, my Swedish-speaking dad, learned English. We are a mixed people, mixed racially, mixed religiously, mixed in terms of national identity. We are a mongrel people. I didn't choose to embrace diversity. I am a product of diversity. I am a mongrel. I'm proud of it. We are a nation, a world people, the subtitle of one of my books. We are losing the sense of the brotherhood and sisterhood of humanity. We are of one blood. We are of one family. And we are being torn apart by those who think they are better than their neighbor. Let's not waste our influence. Let's use our influence. We are a weighty movement, far beyond what our numbers can suggest. I want to thank this wonderful body for bestowing this honor on me of associating my name with the name of the founder of this movement, Felix Adler, who not only was a great philosopher, a profound thinker, but who understood that social involvement was an important part of his work. He worked throughout his life for labor reform, to protect children from exploitation, to reduce vice and crime in New York City. He set the model. There is no such thing as an ethical leader or an ethical member who's diverting resources and time from serving our own people. Our own people are out there. I know that in my day there were many, many good people who supported the activities that I did in the social sphere, but there were always some who said, well, you know, we pay your salary, you should be taking care of this congregation. I did. I worked 90 hours a week to do both. But no, you should give us all that you have. I did. I did. To go out and save someone from going to prison because of his religious or non-religious beliefs, that's serving you. That's serving me. Because as our teacher and leader, Felix Adler, taught us, by serving others, by lifting others up, by empowering others, we grow ourselves. So act as to elicit the best in others and thereby in thyself. Help others to grow and thereby you grow. Spirituality, such a buzzword today, has no meaning if it is not grounded in ethics and social concern. It is nothing but self-indulgence if it has no fruit. I know many people like to say, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. Spirituality is what you feel. Your religion is what you do. It takes both. Thank you.